Hello, everyone. So thank you for joining us for the last talk of the week for the exhibition Disturbing the Balance. Today's talk is titled Network Ecosystems in the Digital Anthropocene. And in the panel, there will be myself and Gaia Tedone, and then the artist Mark Ramos, and then Ethan Edwards, and Danielle McPhatter. Just to give you just a quick, brief recap, during this week we've been organizing talks with the artists that were included in the exhibition Disturbing the Balance. So we started with Matteo Cremonesi of Yukose, and then Joanna Moore in conversation with Forestami, Sultana Zana, and then today's talk. As for the topic of the conversation, I'll just give you a brief introduction and then tell you a little bit more about the speakers. So we stand in the horizon of the Web 3.0 and the promises of new senses, new interfaces, and new experiences. The artists and creative technologists on this panel discuss the critical questions around technological progress and development and the intriguing sensory pleasures of sustainability of simulated ecosystems. Human-made structures where biotic and abiotic components are made to interact with each other for survival. So we are very happy to have like a panel of speakers today. And one of them, as I mentioned, is Mark Ramos, which is one of the artists in the exhibition, along with ZIYANG, who today couldn't be here. Mark Ramos is a Brooklyn-based new media artist. He makes fragile post-colonial technology using web and software programming, physical computing, using computers to sense and react to the physical world, and digital sculpture fabrication to create interactive work that facilitates encounters with our uncertain digital future. Along with Mark, we also have Ethan Edwards and Danielle McPhatter, who were former researchers in the experiments in art and technology at Bell Labs, and actually collaborate with Mark in the making of the artwork presented in the exhibition. Danielle is an interdisciplinary programmer, musician, and artist interested in alternative modes of interactive storytelling that explore the intersections in various modes of connectivity between media and technology. Danielle expresses her passion for the sonic and visual arts via the creation of interactive narrative experiences, games, and installation. Her experience with virtual and augmented reality, motion tracking, creative programming, and physical computing in both the visual and audio domains combine her knowledge of a variety of programming languages and software environments to forge new forms of interaction with technology. And then the final speaker is Ethan Edwards, who is an artist, programmer, designer, musician, and writer based in New York City. His work explores time, history, and daily life through technological interaction and generative structure. He's currently a creative technologist collaborating with artists at EY. Ethan's work and collaborations have been presented at institutions and festivals throughout the world, including Sundance Film Festival and the Rabin Museum of Art and Kronos Art Center. So with this introduction to the panel, I would like to pass the word on to Mark Ramos, who will start with the presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for logging in. Thank you, Marialaura and Gaia from FTP for curating such a compelling online and physical exhibition. And of course, thank you to the great team at Particle for putting together such a great show. Like they kind of said, I'm here to talk about collaborative work called Network Ecosystem. So this work was made with my regular collaborator, another artist named Ziyang Wu, who could not be here because he's actually soft launching our new project, Future Forecast, at the Beijing Times Museum of Art. So we're kind of splitting the difference today. But I'll talk a little bit about network ecosystem. It's a multi-participant online simulation where data is experienced as environmental change. So this was sort of our first time collaboration between ZIYANG and I, but also a collaboration between the engineers and creative technologists at Nokia Bell Labs, two of whom you'll meet today, Ethan and Danielle. So that's me on the left, and that's ZIYANG on the right. So we'll kind of give a walkthrough. I'll give kind of a walkthrough of our project, but also offer this caveat that this work is really meant to be experienced online and on a browser. We really consider it to be an online ecosystem. So please keep in mind that the stills I'll show and the video that we'll see are documentations of an internet artwork that you can visit and experience online. I'll share the link in the screen share. And please visit our piece when the website is live, or participate in the web AR experience. So for this show at Particle, our original piece was made using Unity WebGL, which is not the most responsive on a mobile browser. So we actually made a mobile port where you can kind of create your own networked ecosystem. So the website still is on screen, but you can also scan that QR code with your phone and get access to the web AR port. If you decide to do it, please screenshot and tag us on Instagram. So this project was inspired by several trips to Bell Labs, where the engineer and staff showed us the historical kind of technologies, such as their anechoic chamber and their more kind of current technologies that they are developing. So we were really inspired by this kind of digital ecosystem in the lab where everything is connected. Robot arms and truck robots that are used to deliver and arrange packages, an immersive projection room where you can use haptic gloves and gestures to control all the settings in a network VR factory, or a camera that could display 3 different layers of robotic visions and senses. All of these really inspired us to create a project that could augment the traditional physical senses with new senses that we saw during our visit. So through kind of like experiencing and interacting with this technology, we started to see how many different kinds of digital data were present within the environment, and they were reliant and interconnected to one another, almost like creating a new different kind of ecosystem that was invisible to us at the moment. This ultimately proved to be the foundation for our collaborative work, visualizing this ecosystem and populating it with digital organisms that thrive within it. So network ecosystem is a live simulation environment that presents an ecosystem built of a variety of digital senses. It was originally commissioned by New Inc., Rhizome, and Nokia Bell Labs. Network ecosystem takes machine vision and sensing data collected by Bell Labs experimental robots and sensors and repurposes it to drive a 3D environmental simulation. In networked ecosystem, natural phenomena have been replaced by digital and artificial systems as forces that drive development. Electricity, battery equals sustenance, Wi-Fi signals equal nutrition, Lidar data equals fire and heat, and data organisms populate this digital ecosystem as native life forms in the form of bots, AIs, and avatars. Visitors to this network landscape develop new kinds of digital senses to experience data as environmental change and interact with the simulated world and each other in an ever-changing online environment. So right now you're kind of like hearing ZIYANG and I's perspective as artists, but what was great when we kind of talked about this work was Danielle and Ethan, who were sort of the engineers and creative technologists working with us on this project, had their own kind of perspective that we'll hear about when I'm done talking. So we wanted to present this interaction as almost like a walk in the woods. On a walk like this, one of the important things is communing or being one with nature. smelling the flowers, seeing the sights, etc. This is what visitors to our environment do online. And except online, and the flowers grow in response to digital data sets. We wanted to make digital organisms that were integrated and connected to this environment. So if you kind of play or visit our online simulation, you'll see these sort of flying bug robots that reproduce according to the light levels that are being determined by live sensor readings from the campus and Bell Labs. We also used the Wi-Fi signal strength that the sensors and robots kind of use to communicate, and they are visualizing this sort of cloud of fireflies or multicolored lights that changes its composition and speed depending on the Wi-Fi signal strength. We also wanted to insert some Bell Labs Easter eggs that our visits to the archives kind of informed us about. So there's like the Telstar satellite that's in their lobby, unicycle that Claude Shannon used to ride around the halls of Bell Labs with. And if you're visiting our simulation, you can kind of mouse over some of these Easter egg artifacts, and a little dialogue will pop up. So the visitor starts in this central control and monitoring room where you can find which character is connected to which effect, the Lidar image archive, the details of the sensors, and the full description of the project. So we wanted to find a way to kind of like incorporate the data in its pure form as we were getting it in these like CSV files that we worked with Ethan and Danielle to format a server with. And so you can kind of have access to those sources sort of where you start off in this control and monitoring room. So from the engineers at Bell Labs, we received tons of data sets containing information about robot positioning and movement, environmental gecko sensors, audio location, LiDAR imagery, and more. And we began to experiment with these data sets to create different effects in our simulation. Eventually, we also worked with the engineers to create a data pipeline where this data is uploaded and used by our project dynamically. So that part is still happening. And when you visit our simulation online, it's still online and live. So for us, this project kind of brought up these questions about what kind of future are we envisioning. A future that any boundary between the IRL and URL are gone. There's no more need to distinguish between online and physical because they are really the same. In this reality, online data isn't just what you see on the screen, but something that you experience in a sensory way. In this future, you may experience changes in Wi-Fi signal strength like sunlight on your skin. When you go hiking, you'll see the forest around you using LiDAR, or literally scuba dive through oceans of data as AIs float around you like jellyfish algorithms. We thought that network ecosystem could provide a speculative glimpse into this kind of near future, where a new kind of environment has been constructed digitally. We just need to evolve the new senses to fully participate. So there's a silly GIF of ZIYANG and I. Please feel free to follow, like, and repost. We wanted to, here is a brief video documentation. It's about 3 minutes of the simulation that you can view online. I'll play this. And then we also have just some brief footage of other iterations of this project that kind of spawned from this initial sort of work. So I'll just play this for a minute. So this is video documentation of the online simulation that you can visit at Base Milano. This is what's installed at Base Milano. For the particle show, we did an AR port of this, but we also have a couple other iterations of this project that I'll just go through really briefly. So here is the link to visit Networked Ecosystem Online. What you just saw was like a video walkthrough of it, but if you would like to enter the simulation yourself, here is the link to do so. Or you could visit Base Milano on the last day of this great exhibition. But we also made kind of like an interactive sort of physical installation of it for the Song Museum of Art in China. And we collaborated with the engineers at Alibaba to create kind of an AR port that is specific to these sort of immersive augmented reality glasses that they have. And I'll just show video of that too. So I think that's it for me. So from this kind of initial seed at Bell Labs and working with Ethan and Danielle, ZIYANG and I really have kind of continued to evolve this work. We have another project that's sort of similar, using data from the zeitgeist, as I like to call it, called Future Forecast, that we are releasing this year. And we're lucky to have Danielle and Ethan with us today. Thanks everyone for listening to me talk and perhaps getting through my first slideshow online without any major technical glitches.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Danielle and Ethan, for being here. And I wonder if you can both tell us a little bit your side of the story of participating and collaborating into this project. Maybe Danielle, you want to start?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it was wonderful to be able to participate in the creation of the work with Mark and ZIYANG. I'll give a little history of the experiments in art and technology, lab and program before we jump into the specific project. But for those of you that are aware of EAT, it has a big historical background. There was experiments between early times of engineers and artists back in the experimental or avant-garde era of art. A lot of that based in New York City. It was sort of underground within Bell Labs, and there are some key figures that we can mention and talk about more here. But it was the inception of this overlap and thinking of perspective between art and technology combining those experimental artists and the engineers within the Bell Labs ecosystem. And when we had come back, and I think it was 2016 at the time, and we had tried to re-envision what the experiments in our technology lab could look like within EAT, within Bell Labs at the time, it was great to see that program, or that life or that history reimagined in the program that Ethan and I were able to participate in. So the vision of the lab at our time was to create alternative or new modes of communication. And we had looked at different emerging technologies, including data and simulation with Mark and ZIYANG, and how we could reimagine that from a new perspective. So it was wonderful to be a part of the project and to bring life to this data in a new way. I mean, as Mark mentioned, we were working with robotics labs and physical computing in very different ways. So it was very nice to see how the data could persist in this new ecology, and we could reimagine those invisible connections, as Mark said, between the network that we couldn't see physically in the real space, understand how that digitized in this new immersive environment, and see that persistence over time. Ethan, if you wanted to add anything, I know you have a lot more experience in the...
I mean, you kind of tackled everything, but maybe to talk about it from a slightly different perspective, that a lot of the reasons we worked with artists at sort of Bell Labs in general was because of really just kind of different ways of approaching problems. That it tended to be that a lot of the engineers and scientists tended to view problems, tended to view sort of working on things as really an incremental thing, that they were focused on, here's the parameters of the problem, how can we get a little bit better performance, how can we improve this a little bit? And I think what's so exciting about projects like Networked Ecosystem is that they show the just massive benefits to thinking, what if we don't just conceive of this as a linear problem? What if we tackle it from a totally different angle? So just concretely, this is really, in some ways, it is an excellent artwork. In other ways, it is actually kind of pointing to a potential future for understanding of data, and like just even more concretely, data visualization. That it's tended to be, when you talk about what's the future of data visualization, people imagine, okay, what if we did line charts in 3D? What if, we just took our standard things, did some little improvement, made it render faster, made the graphics a little clearer, something like that. Mark and ZIYANG were able to come and say, well, what if we took this data and did something completely different with it, actually have a completely different kind of human understanding than what you get from, say, a line graph. And it was fascinating to honestly show this project back to the engineering community, because we had that moment of realization of, I've never really thought of understanding the world in this same way, that you could do it through actually a more complicated, richer ecosystem rather than as just a simplification of complicated data. That process of sort of complexification that this represents, I think, is fascinating. And frankly, I think that it's something that not only Mark and ZIYANG should still be working on, it's something that really a lot of research institutions should be exploring more, because I think it's a fascinating idea that will probably end up really actually possibly making big changes into how we do research and how we better use computer simulation to understand things.
One other thing I did want to add is it became this beautiful process that we were seeing over and over again with Mark and ZIYANG's process, and then also with the other artists that we were working with, where the engineering community at Bell Labs was starting to understand that science or technology and the arts were not that different. And it was just assessing the world and asking questions about the world, but from different perspectives. And every time we would engage with the research community, over time, they would be more accepting and understanding and more enthused about working with the artist to understand that perspective from that more human-centric, culture-centric perspective, and how they could start to bring some of that perspective back into the engineering and technology work. So it really became an ecosystem in that sort of behalf of the engineers were starting to get excited about the perspective of the artists and how they might think about that in the way that they implement those technologies that they would then work toward developing for the future.
And, it's great to hear about the, the positive aspect as well of this interaction between the world of art and science and the collaboration. And, what were the actually really difficult bits on the other end, like the most more challenging aspects? Maybe Mark, you can also start in answering that.
I think for us, and this just might be part of our practice, is that as artists, I don't know if we like ever approach a project like completely confident in the tools that we're going to use to make it. So for ZIYANG and I, though we were like familiar with some of the frameworks that we ended up using to kind of execute the work, like the Unity kind of platform, AWS or Amazon Web Services, and creating like a data pipeline. It was also like we were kind of learning as we went along. And so I think that our process is always a little bit this kind of like process of discovery, which is great. But I think then it becomes somewhat more of a challenge to balance like the conceptual goals of the work. And so we really wanted to kind of like talk about what does an ecosystem kind of look like online? What could this like electronic virtual ecosystem be? And it was sometimes difficult to focus on one thing or the other because you were also sort of trying to learn about the tools that you're using to make the work.
Mm-hmm. How about you guys? If you can report on some of the most challenging maybe aspects of the process.
I can add my 2 cents and then I'll leave it to Ethan as well, since he was more directly involved in the creation of the data pipeline. I think, as I was mentioning, one of the more difficult aspects of it from our side was actually getting the engineering community to understand, why would people even want to represent the data in this way. I mean, as Mark was mentioning, there's a lot of the data points that were used for this experience were actually extracted from an experience that Bell Labs was working on related to industrial automation and the future of sensing. So they had all this data that they were storing related to, the movement of the robotics in the space, the way that sensors were embedded in this lab and research environment. And it was definitely a task at the very beginning to get the engineers to understand why we wanted to reimagine the data in this way. But it was just, a matter of experiencing it. And once, they got to experience the work of ZIYANG and Mark, they started to understand, the significance of why you might want to visualize data in this way. Why, as Ethan said, the future of this is not looking at bar charts and, static designs, but it really is immersion in the data to understand it and get new insights about, the interaction of the data within the space that it's representing.
Yeah.
I think interestingly enough, the hardest part for my contribution was not so much network ecosystem, but the ecosystem of networks. There was a lot of just making different aspects of all the networks that kind of make up the behind the scenes structures of the network that we had to deal with, of getting things from Bell Labs sort of private networks and how those are stored onto more public facing things using an AWS infrastructure, to tying that into Unity. So it was sort of a process actually of doing very technical, very concrete work, but in some ways sort of resonant with the themes of the piece. So I kind of had a nice double dose of thinking about all this.
Yeah, I think that really nicely leads into my other question, which is more of a thought that also was developed just now looking at Mark's slides, as well as the actual work being an ecosystem, like a network, like it's still live in a sense. So I think that's a really interesting way in general, like more generally, to think about web-based work and as kind of living ecosystem that are sort of supported by invisible networks and so forth. And sometimes when we maybe look at work online, we just, focus on the interface and so forth, but actually there is a kind of hidden side of it. Maybe Mark, you want to respond to that as an artist producing this kind of project?
Yeah, I think it was important, and like that was one of the things that ZIYANG and I talked about when we were sort of presenting it, that it was important to kind of talk about the work as like existing in real time online, as opposed to kind of just being experienced as like a video, or even in the other iterations that we did that were not necessarily linked in real time to the data. That was like a big part of the concept for us, was kind of creating this online space that was significant because of its sort of synchronicity or its connection to real-time phenomena. So I think that was like a big part of the work for us, was that it was like representative of something happening in real life, and not just like a web page that you were viewing or a video that you were seeing online, or and that there was element to it that was like a real kind of, for lack of a better term, living ecosystem that was living its life online.
Yeah, indeed. Do you want to add something to this aspect, Ethan or Danielle?
I was just going to add that I really appreciate about this work the persistence of this data. I mean, when we were organizing to grab this data from, as Ethan mentioned, the private networks and Bell Labs, it was a snapshot of time that, you know, would have otherwise just got lost in the cogs of data that was existing already. But Mark and ZIYANG were able to take this data and provide, you know, new meaning to it. In addition to that, there's other layers of snapshots in time that they introduced here via the Easter eggs related to, you know, the history of Bell Labs and those kinds of snapshots. So it's interesting, the layering of different times over this as it exists in this new envisionment of this ecosystem of data. Yeah, just beautiful theoretically about how they thought about these different snapshots and the integration of it through this new lived experience.
Yeah, I mean, maybe actually to go over to this kind of question about, will artificial ecosystems become essential in everyday life? I would certainly say that they are already, that there's these sorts of, you know, much more concretely physical ones, like, you know, the robots, the different sensors that we're talking about. But I would say that what we've seen just technologically is a lot of things that structurally are like ecosystems that have an impact on our life, but that have actually difficulties with really visibility. You know, this is just sort of speculating, but I think that there's some ways in which the financial infrastructure of the world is an example of an ecosystem-like structure that's important, but that actually sort of requires a group of people who have particular understanding. And part of the problem we have as a modern society is that the understanding is opaque. You see that evolving now with further developments in this. And then what I was pointing to there, where, you know, a lot of the internet and network structure is something that is intentionally intended to be opaque to most users, but really can impact our lives. I think of every single time AWS goes down and a lot of people end up with the realization of, all the sites I use are down. I had no idea that all my sites were dependent on this single entity. I think networked ecosystems, right, is sort of resisting that trend of taking the ecosystemification of a lot of the background structures of our lives, making that opaque, and instead is really trying to find new ways to make it transparent, make it actually interesting, and be able to be played with in different ways than just extremely technical and restricted ways of engaging with the world.
Yeah, I think to like that was like a great way to kind of like articulate that. I wish we maybe had articulated that idea a little bit more in the piece, but if you like think of like the kind of complexity of an ecosystem, like getting an Amazon package delivered to you, there are so many like moving parts that need to sort of kind of function, and so many sort of like intersecting areas of labor and digital technology and networks that are sometimes intentionally obfuscated Like we don't necessarily see all of those aspects of the ecosystem. Some of them are hidden from us. And so kind of with this work, I think we were trying to make those ideas visible in some way, as that this is part of like a whole environment that we can interact with. And we don't necessarily just need to kind of like participate on a user end, that we can kind of like immerse ourselves in an entire kind of network.
I think it's very interesting that you're talking, I mean, this idea of like a transparency came up because like in the, you know, in the exhibition, I mean, Gaia and I were invited to respond to this idea of sustainability, and the whole kind of like digital exhibition revolves around asking the you know, for whom we sustain and why do we sustain. And we chose kind of like artworks that in different ways presented different perspective of thinking around like this idea, like making system more transparent, infrastructure more transparent, etc., etc. And that's also one of the reasons we chose your artwork. So I don't know, I just wanted to ask you, what's if you have to imagine a sustainable ecosystem, what comes to your mind?
I think that's like a really, really tough question. It was a little like I think like when we were making the work, we didn't necessarily have this kind of like idea of sustainability or like environmentalism as it's kind of talked about now a lot with like climate change. Like that wasn't like our specific focus. I mean, in fact, that there's a lot of, I think, about the work kind of in context to those things that's open to critique. Like the work is kind of stored on these servers that need to, you know, much like an NFT needs to kind of remain on all the time and powered in order for it to kind of exist. So there's that like, you know, huge tension in kind of in exploring like a online simulation as an ecosystem that is in a lot of ways part of this sort of system of consuming fossil fuels just to exist, right? So there's like that tension already kind of implicit within the work. I think that I can only like kind of respond in a speculative way and say like Web3 sort of imagines that our interactions will sort of take place in these online immersive places. So in some ways, we need to kind of start thinking more critically about ideas of sustainability, because these sort of connected online stimulated spaces are probably going to be more commonplace in the future and how we use them. But maybe Ether or Danielle have a better answer.
This is a good answer also.
I mean, it's something for us that we've been thinking about as well. I mean, a lot of the work that we've been doing recently is related to these virtual worlds, and one newer interaction or layer for these worlds is that they're going to continue to be persistent. And one of the things that I appreciate or love a lot when I look at the description of this work is that it has infinite duration. So it'll continue to exist and sustain itself online as long as the ecosystem for the creation, for what has created it, exists. So in this instance, where you can think of sustainability from a different lens of not necessarily, you know, related to our physical environment, but how will these worlds that we're creating persist and sustain online as we become more a blend within our physical and digital existences and selves?
Yeah, I think there's layers. There's the physical layers of energy, of sort of like just basic sort of necessities that end up supporting the larger layers, both of the computer systems, but also the societal structures that allow the artwork to exist. It's all kind of based off of the same, you know, sort of system ultimately, where there's a lot of interdependence built in, and it depends on all those things continuing to coexist and cooperate.
Great. Thanks so much. I think we might want to take some couple of comments or questions from the audience, perhaps. Is there any comments or questions? Question for all. Shall I read it? How do you think technology, science, and art could be more and more connected? Who are the key actors to engage? What is the perfect framework for this connection to occur?
I mean, I think that that's kind of what like Danielle and Ethan were sort of doing in their roles at Bell Labs, were sort of facilitating these connections that maybe happened more organically in the past. One of the things that like I think was really kind of significant about the Experiments in Art and Technology program was it had its roots like kind of way back in the 60s when like some of these collaborations between artists and technologists or artists and engineers didn't seem so polar opposite as maybe they are positioned to be right now. I don't know. I mean, I think that like in kind of today's society, we have a tendency to think of art and science as like being very separate, but there was like a time, you know, if we look at like, you know, historic people like Da Vinci who really thought of like art and science as kind of being the same. So I think that, you know, that was part of what Ethan and Danielle, or at least how like we kind of saw their role, was really facilitating those connections again.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I said earlier, although it's difficult for people to understand at a face value, technology, science, and art are all really cut from the same cloth. They're answering or asking very similar questions of the world, but just answering it from very different journeys, perspective, questions, lived experiences. And when it came to our role at Bell Labs, as Mark had mentioned, we were sort of the liaisons, or for, you know, a better world, we were the translators to try to mediate some of those differences, especially from the engineering and the science community, where people tend to think very binary or in zeros and ones. There was at the very beginning some issues with being able to quote unquote translate some of the, you know, ideas that some of the artists had. But I think continuous engagements between those communities to help them understand that they are answering the same questions just from different perspectives is super important. And for the interaction in Bell Labs, our role was super important to be able to translate and find that common ground and commonality to, you know, break away those borders and stop that separation between those different communities, to just show, you know, each other where their likeness was.
I think we lost Ethan, but here it is.
Yes. No, I was just going to focus on the key actors to engage. That a lot of Danielle and I's experience doing this was that when you talk to people in abstract about do science and art have things in common, oftentimes they'll say yes. When you get more concretely, does your work specifically have anything to do with this? They tend to be a little bit more shy. There's not really a ready engagement. People won't necessarily seek it out. But if you end up putting them in conversation, people are a lot more willing to engage with these different ways of thinking than you might expect. That was honestly my biggest surprise, and has continued to be my biggest surprise when doing this work, is that folks I would have assumed would have no interest in going outside their discipline, when actually put in the same room with someone thinking differently, they were willing to engage because they care deeply about the ideas. I think a lot of the reason why we don't have more of these collaborations, especially in more than just sort of one-off special residency situations, is because we tend to just take for granted these disciplinary barriers that people won't really want to go outside, and you know that's a hard thing. But it's a lot easier, and it just comes down to identifying people who might collaborate, who might get along in some way, and just seeing what happens. And you know, not trying to force anything, not trying to force people to change their ideas, but just that exposure to different ways of thinking and different ways of approaching a problem, if they really care deeply about the problem they're working on, will be effective.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
I will also add that I think to kind of speak to the strength of the connection that Danielle and Ethan's work like really helped to facilitate is we're kind of still, like ZIYANG and I are still sort of showing this work almost 2 years later, and we still kind of communicate with Danielle and Ethan regularly. So the collaboration is like something that really kind of stayed present even after like the program that we were in or the fellowship that we were in sort of ended. So I think that kind of speaks to sort of the strength of these connections once they're made.
Great. So another question is, how will the experiences in the virtual world reflect into our physical world? Big question.
Yeah, I think a lot these days, especially, since the pandemic, the line between our physical existence and our virtual existence has become to, completely blur, in which a lot of our functions and the things that we do to sustain ourselves have, come behind a screen. And that sort of facilitates the way that we exist in some way. But we're starting to think about, or we tend to think about a lot, actually, what are the markers of our existence as a human, as humans very embedded in the physical world? How can we take those experiences into the virtual world to create new experiences? So how can we go beyond, regular Zoom or regular discussions on a screen to embed ourselves in new virtual worlds and new ecosystems that are more true to the way that we interact as humans, the way that we want to collaborate and exist in this world, as again, those lines become more blurred in the way that we experience our lives.
I think when we talk about social reality right now, what we typically mean are things that are non-mediated, right? That in-person conversations, in-person socializing is the ground truth, so to speak. And I think that that is definitely starting to fray in important ways. It's not necessarily bad, but there's definitely a way in which the ecosystem of just socialization of society is becoming more digital than physical. The physical is really just kind of an imperfect realization of that digital ground truth, right? It's, much more fixed. You have sort of a record of everything that's occurred. And I think you'll start to see people complaining, for example, like, I don't like my conversing as much person to person because then I don't have a record. Then it doesn't update my trackers for all these different things. And that's something I'm a little worried about. I think that there's a recent argument by, there was a philosopher who wrote a book recently on just the notion of reality, making the argument that just in general, reality is really what we make of it. Virtual reality is real as long as that's the place where we're actually living. And if we do end up living there, that will be the case. I buy the argument.
Yeah, I think I know the book you're referring to. It's almost the kind of, the question of what is reality is currently really being challenged in a sense. And of course, here we enter in the realm of philosophy, and it's a big one. But I think the point of that book is virtual reality is less real because it's virtual. So it's just really those boundaries are starting to fade away. But I think what I liked about also the introduction of Mark talk is still the attention to the senses, and this is in perception, and this in the body in a sense, and this is also something that is in the show through I'm thinking of another work by Sultana Zana like also retaining the ability to listen, though, like to really be in the body and to sense, and that will never fade away because we are in the body. So I think these are just really interesting thoughts. Do we have time? Yeah, maybe last question. Still, as we enter in the big philosophical questions. So how will blended experience merge and affect our identity as individuals and as a society? Probably need a whole panel to unravel this, but it would be nice to just have your quick views and or thoughts or provocations.
I think that is what partly the kind of collaboration with Alibaba was sort of trying to answer in like a very commercial way. How will sort of like blended experiences, I mean, I think in their in kind of a focused view that Alibaba had, kind of change the ways that we maybe interact with capital. If we're able to kind of like have these like sort of interfaces that are activated by our body. But I'm kind of interested in sort of what An Xiaomina has to kind of say about sort of technology and the developing world, and how the ability to kind of share personal experiences that someone in a colonized country can kind of share the music that they're listening to or how they interact with technology is way different than kind of just viewing data like on a screen about those sorts of things. I did no justice to that actual quote, but maybe Ethan and Danielle can say something else.
Sorry, there was a little bit of a loading there. But when I look at this question, the main thing that I'm focusing on, I think it's through some recent conversation that Ethan and I have had with the artistic community, is this element of identity. And I think when it comes to identity, we've been thinking about our identity in the virtual world as we experience these more blended experiences is really being shaped by the way that technology sees us. So technology is looking at us from a variety of lenses. There's machine vision that's, and understand our identity from that perspective, recognizes, et cetera. Our data that's persistent following us, that has metrics of, who we are in a sense. And technology is doing a lot to try to understand us in a degree, but also to a degree also homogenizing who we are by trying to classify us in different brackets of, male, female, this age bracket, et cetera. There are classifications that are not as significant to our human experience, but are, integral-ish to the way that, technology sees us. And I think what we're thinking about now a lot, since again, these experiences that we're having in the virtual and the physical are becoming more blended, is how can we as humans and individuals embedded in society change the way that technology identifies us, and trying to step away from the way that technology is homogenizing us or putting us into categories that we don't necessarily identify with, and how can we reclaim that in new ways is definitely something that we've been thinking about in terms of, how our identity develops or emerges into these new blended experiences.
Yeah, no, I think there's kind of a multiplication of identity that just comes with more sort of digital mediated venues, that there's people aren't necessarily fixed anymore to their single physical incarnation. I think it's basically a wait and see as to how that really affects things, but I think we're going to see some real complexities. It's really more an intensification of something that was already there, but more so people embodying qualities and identities based off of the places they inhabit, with a lot of those places not being what we call usually real.
Yeah, wow. So many interesting reflection food for thoughts, but I think it does also circle back to, the need for further conversation to happen across the fields of culture and technology. And I think this expanding upon Mark and ZIYANG's work, and having Ethan and Danielle here today has been such a great occasion to do that. And so this kind of conversation needs to happen more often, we think. But I just want to thank you really for your time and for sharing your experience and vision, and thank Mark and ZIYANG for being part of the digital exhibition Disturbing the Balance. I don't know if Marialaura, also you want to say some concluding remarks?
No remarks, but I just want to thank you everyone for being here today and for the interesting conversation. And
thank you also for the smooth running of the event at the particle end. And bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.